Good evening, seekers. Tonight, we begin beside the water. Long before there were libraries, before there were maps with borders drawn across them, people gathered near rivers because rivers meant life. They fed fields, carried boats, supplied drinking water, and turned dry ground into places where cities could rise. But the same water that nourished a civilization could also erase it. A river could climb its banks in the night. A storm far upstream could send destruction toward people who never saw the rain. A coast could change beneath the feet of generations, and when the water finally withdrew, it could leave behind a world that looked almost familiar, but not quite. Homes gone, fields buried, roads vanished beneath mud, the dead missing. The survivors left to understand how something as ordinary as water had suddenly become large enough to swallow everything they knew. Perhaps this is why flood stories appear so early in human memory. They are found in some of the oldest written traditions we possess, and echoes of them appear far beyond the lands where those first stories were pressed into clay. A great inundation arrives. The normal order of the world breaks apart. A few people survive while others are carried away. Boats, animals, mountains, warnings from the gods, renewed earth, and the beginning of a new age appear again and again. The details change with language, landscape, religion, and time, but the image remains strangely persistent. Water rising until the old world is no longer safe. That resemblance has fascinated people for centuries. It invites a question that sounds simple until we try to answer it. Did the ancient world remember the same flood? It is tempting to imagine one catastrophe so immense that communities across the earth preserved fragments of the same event, passing them down through generations until each culture shaped the memory into its own story. It is an extraordinary possibility, and because it is extraordinary, it deserves patience. Myths can travel, stories can be borrowed, altered, and carried along trade routes. Different peoples can also experience different disasters that leave behind similar memories. Floods are common in the very places where civilizations tend to grow, and human beings separated by great distances can still respond to danger in remarkably similar ways. Yet, the flood traditions of the ancient Near East are especially difficult to dismiss as coincidence, because there we can watch the story changing across time. In Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates could nourish cities and destroy them with equal indifference, scribes wrote of divine anger, a chosen survivor, a great vessel, animals brought aboard, waters covering the land, and birds released to search for dry ground. Centuries later, familiar elements would appear again in another tradition, arranged within a different theology and given a different meaning. The stories are not identical, but they are related closely enough that somewhere behind them lies a long history of memory, retelling, and transformation. And beyond Mesopotamia, the picture becomes stranger. Ancient peoples in regions shaped by rivers, monsoons, coastlines, and seasonal storms also told of worlds overwhelmed by water. Some of those stories may have grown independently from local disasters. Others may have absorbed older tales carried by travelers. Some may preserve faint cultural memories of real flooding or changing coastlines, while still others may be stories about something deeper than geology. Floods make powerful myths because they transform the world without leaving it empty. Water covers, recedes, and reveals. After the flood, the land remains, changed and scarred, waiting for people to begin again. So tonight, we will not begin by deciding that every flood story proves one ancient global catastrophe, nor will we dismiss them as inventions simply because they became myths. Instead, we will listen to them as ancient people might have heard them, as stories told in the shadow of rivers whose moods could determine whether a city flourished or disappeared. Somewhere between geology and legend, Between catastrophe and storytelling, there may be an answer waiting. Or perhaps there is something more interesting than an answer. The possibility that human beings have always remembered disaster in the same way, by turning fear into story, loss into meaning, and survival into something worth telling beside the water. Section 2. If we want to understand why flood stories took such deep root in the ancient world, we have to begin in a place where water could never be treated as harmless. Mesopotamia was built between rivers, and those rivers gave life to a landscape that could otherwise be dry, harsh, and difficult to farm. The Tigris and Euphrates made agriculture possible on a scale large enough to support towns, temples, markets, and eventually some of the earliest cities in human history. But the same waters that nourished those settlements could also turn against them with frightening speed. Rivers could rise, channels could shift, levees could break, and a season of abundance could become a season of ruin before people had time to understand what was happening. To live in southern Mesopotamia was to understand that civilization itself rested on something unstable. The people who settled there learned to shape the landscape with canals, embankments, drainage systems, and walls of packed earth. But none of those things could ever make the rivers completely predictable. Water had to be managed constantly, and because so much depended on it, the control of water became part of the structure of society. Fields, harvests, transport, trade, and survival were all connected to the movement of the rivers. When the waters behaved, cities flourished. When they did not, the consequences could be devastating. That makes the appearance of flood stories in this region feel less mysterious. A great inundation was not an abstract fear invented by storytellers. It belonged to the lived experience of the people who built their homes near these rivers, and archaeology confirms that major floods did strike ancient settlements. At sites such as Shuruppak, Ur, and Kish, layers of flood-deposited silt have been found in the ground, though they do not all date to the same moment and do not point toward one single flood covering the whole of Mesopotamia. Instead, they suggest a landscape where destructive flooding happened more than once, sometimes with enough force to leave a permanent trace beneath the ruins of later cities. For the people who endured one of those disasters, the distinction between a regional flood and a world-ending flood may not have meant very much. Their world was not a globe seen from above. It was the city they knew, the fields beyond its walls, the roads they traveled, the neighboring settlements they had heard of, and the horizon beyond which certainty faded. If all of that vanished beneath muddy water, then from the perspective of those survivors, the world itself had been overwhelmed. That is where memory begins to change. A disaster survives first in the minds of those who lived through it, but as those people grow old and die, the event has to pass into story if it is going to remain. Details soften, meaning grows, fear becomes warning, survival becomes something worth explaining. A catastrophe that once belonged to one generation can gradually become a tale told by another. And eventually, the story may carry more than the event itself ever did. It begins to explain the gods, the fragility of human life, the danger of pride, the possibility of renewal, or simply the unsettling truth that everything people build can disappear. In Mesopotamia, some of those memories eventually entered writing, and that is what makes this tradition especially important. Clay tablets allow us to see flood stories not merely as distant folklore, but as literature that was copied, preserved, altered, and retold across centuries. One of the earliest surviving versions appears in Sumerian tradition and centers on a ruler named Ziusudra, who survives a catastrophic flood after receiving divine warning. Much of the tablet is damaged, and parts of the story are missing, but enough remains to reveal the familiar shape of a world threatened by water and a chosen human being who somehow endures. What matters most is that the flood is already more than weather. It has become part of a larger story about the relationship between humanity and the divine. The destruction carries meaning, and survival carries meaning too. Somewhere between the real floods that struck ancient settlements and the written stories that survived in clay, disaster had been transformed into memory, and memory had been transformed into myth. That transformation may be the key to everything that follows. Even if a real flood once stood behind one of these stories, what survived was never only the water. What survived was the human attempt to understand what the water had done. Section 3. As the flood story moved deeper into Mesopotamian literature, it became richer, stranger, and more human. The surviving Sumerian tale of Ziusudra gives us only part of the picture, but later, Akkadian texts preserve the tradition with greater clarity. Among the most important is the story of Atrahasis, a wise man whose name means something like exceedingly wise. In this version, the flood grows out of tension between the gods and humanity, and that tension reveals something about how ancient Mesopotamians imagined their place in the universe. The world of Atrahasis is filled with divine beings who are powerful, emotional, and often divided among themselves. Human beings have been created to perform labor the gods no longer wish to do, but as humanity multiplies, the noise of human life becomes unbearable to the god Enlil. The problem is not a single crime that demands punishment. Humanity has simply become too numerous and too difficult to ignore. Enlil tries to reduce the population through suffering and disaster, but another god, Enki, continues to help people survive. Eventually, Enlil decides that only a flood will solve the problem. The choice is frightening because it is so impersonal. The people about to die are not judged one by one. They are caught inside a conflict among powers far greater than themselves, and destruction comes because the divine order has decided that human life has become disruptive. To people living beside unpredictable rivers, that idea may have felt painfully familiar. Catastrophe did not always look like justice. Sometimes the water simply rose. Enki refuses to allow humanity to disappear completely. Bound by the decisions of the other gods, he finds a way to warn Atrahasis indirectly, giving him enough knowledge to prepare. Atrahasis is told to abandon the life he knows and build a vessel before the coming storm. When the flood arrives, the story becomes dark and violent. The weather turns so terrible that even the gods are frightened by what they have unleashed. The world outside disappears beneath storm and water, while Atrahasis remains enclosed within the only refuge left between life and destruction. When the waters finally recede, Atrahasis emerges and offers a sacrifice. The gods gather around it, and the story takes an unexpected turn. The destruction of humanity has created a problem even for the divine world. Without people, the old order no longer functions as before. The flood has solved one crisis only by creating another, and the renewed world must now be arranged differently. Humanity survives, but it does not return unchanged. New limits are placed upon human life so that population will never again grow without restraint. Mortality and suffering become part of the balance that follows catastrophe. The story, therefore, does more than explain how someone survived a flood. It offers an explanation for why human existence is fragile, why life is limited, and why suffering belongs to the world. Centuries later, the flood appears again in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the most famous literary work to survive from ancient Mesopotamia. Gilgamesh is not searching for a flood story. He is searching for a way to escape death. After losing his closest friend, he becomes consumed by the knowledge that his own life will also end. His journey eventually brings him to Utnapishtim, a mysterious survivor from an age before his own, a man who has somehow been granted a life beyond the ordinary human limit. To explain why, Utnapishtim tells him about the flood. The story is familiar in shape, but its meaning has changed. Now the catastrophe is part of a meditation on mortality. The flood becomes evidence that even the destruction of almost everything does not remove death from the world. Cities can be rebuilt, survivors can begin again, and generations can return to the land, but human life remains temporary. That is what makes the Mesopotamian flood tradition so powerful. It was never only about water. It became a way of thinking about survival, divine power, human weakness, and the uncomfortable truth that even those who escape one ending cannot escape every ending. As Gilgamesh listens to Utnapishtim, the memory of an ancient catastrophe becomes something deeply personal. The flood has passed, the world has returned, and yet the oldest fear remains. Everything that lives is temporary. Section 4. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood story is given a form that feels both ancient and strangely familiar. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that the gods once decided to destroy humanity with water, but one god, Ea, chose to warn him in secret. The warning comes indirectly, carried through the wall of his house, and Utnapishtim is told to abandon his possessions, tear down what he has built, and prepare a vessel large enough to preserve life through the coming disaster. The instructions are urgent because there is no time to argue with what has been decided. Utnapishtim gathers his family, craftsmen, animals, and what he can save, then enters the vessel before the storm begins. Once the doors are sealed, the world outside becomes unrecognizable. The sky darkens. Wind and water overwhelm the land. The violence of the storm is described with such force that even the gods become afraid of what they have unleashed and retreat from the destruction. For 6 days and 7 nights, the flood rages. When the 7th day arrives, the storm grows quiet. Utnapishtim opens a window and looks out upon a world that has become water. The land is gone beneath the surface, and the silence afterward is almost as powerful as the storm itself. Eventually, the vessel comes to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim waits, uncertain whether the earth has truly returned, and then begins releasing birds in search of dry ground. A dove is sent out first, but it finds nowhere to rest and returns. A swallow follows and also comes back. Finally, a raven is released, and when it does not return, Utnapishtim understands that the waters have fallen enough for life to continue. It is difficult to hear this sequence without noticing how familiar it sounds. A chosen survivor receives a divine warning, builds a vessel, preserves animals and family, survives a flood that destroys the surrounding world, comes to rest near a mountain, and sends birds out to discover whether the land has reappeared. These details would later appear again in one of the most famous flood stories in human history, the story of Noah in the Hebrew Bible. The similarities are too strong to ignore, but they do not mean the stories are identical. They belong to different religious worlds and express different ideas about why the flood happened, what the divine intended, and what the survival of humanity meant afterward. In the Mesopotamian tradition, the gods can disagree, make mistakes, and even fear the consequences of their own decisions. In the biblical account, the story is shaped around one God, moral judgment, covenant, and a renewed relationship between the divine and humanity. What the similarities do suggest is that the biblical flood story did not appear in a cultural vacuum. The peoples of the ancient Near East lived beside one another, fought one another, traded with one another, and carried stories across generations. Mesopotamian literature was already old by the time later Hebrew traditions took written form. The flood narrative had been circulating for centuries, perhaps much longer, changing as it moved through languages and cultures. That does not make the later story meaningless or somehow less important. Stories are rarely weakened by having a history. If anything, their journeys reveal how powerful certain ideas were. A flood story could survive because each generation found something inside it that still mattered. One culture might see divine conflict, another moral judgment, another the fragility of human civilization, but the image of the world disappearing beneath water remained strong enough to be retold. There is also something deeply human in the moment when Utnapishtim sends the birds away from the vessel. After all the divine arguments and cosmic destruction, the story narrows to a simple question: is there somewhere to stand? For anyone who has endured a disaster, that question may be more important than all the others. When the storm ends, when the noise stops, when the old world has been changed beyond recognition, the first hope is not for greatness or glory. It is for ground, a dry place, a sign that the world still exists beyond the walls that kept you alive. And perhaps that is one reason this image survived for so long. The bird leaving the vessel carries more than a search for land. It carries the hope that catastrophe has limits, that water eventually recedes, and that even after the world seems to disappear, something may still be waiting beyond the horizon. Section 5. By the time the flood story appears in the Hebrew Bible, many of its oldest shapes are already familiar, but the meaning has changed. The story of Noah belongs to the same ancient world that produced the tales of Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim, yet it speaks in a different voice. The flood is no longer the result of disagreement among competing gods, nor does humanity face destruction simply because it has become too noisy or numerous. In Genesis, the catastrophe is framed as a judgment upon a world that has become violent and corrupt. That difference changes the emotional center of the story. In the older Mesopotamian traditions, disaster can feel arbitrary, almost as though human beings are trapped beneath decisions made by divine powers who do not fully agree with one another. In the biblical account, the flood carries a moral meaning. Noah survives because he is described as righteous within his generation, and his survival becomes part of a larger promise about what will happen when the waters finally withdraw. The shape of the story remains strikingly familiar. Noah receives a warning before the disaster, builds a vessel, enters with his family, and preserves animals while the waters rise around them. The old landscape disappears beneath the flood, and when the vessel eventually comes to rest near mountains, birds are sent out to search for signs that the earth has returned. At last, dry ground appears. Noah leaves the ark, and an offering is made. But the ending moves in a direction that is distinctly its own. After the flood, the world is not simply restarted. A covenant is made, and the rainbow becomes a sign that the earth will not again be destroyed in the same way. After the darkness of the storm and the long uncertainty of the waters, the story closes with reassurance. Survival is followed by promise. For generations, this became the flood story most familiar to readers in the West. The older Mesopotamian versions remained buried until archaeologists and scholars began recovering and translating cuneiform tablets in the 19th century. When the flood episode from the Epic of Gilgamesh became known, the resemblance to Genesis caused enormous excitement. It was suddenly clear that a story with many of the same features had existed in Mesopotamia centuries before the biblical text reached its final form. That discovery did not solve the mystery. It only changed the question. The issue was no longer whether the stories resembled one another, because they plainly did. The deeper question became how that resemblance had come to exist. Ancient peoples were never as isolated as they can seem from a distance. Stories moved with travelers, merchants, soldiers, migrants, and scribes. A tale could pass from one language into another, change as it entered a new religious world, and eventually become so deeply rooted in a different culture that it no longer felt borrowed at all. The people of Judah later lived through the Babylonian exile, when many were taken into Mesopotamia after the destruction of Jerusalem in the 6th century BCE. By then, Mesopotamian flood traditions were already very old, and contact between these cultural worlds was unavoidable. That does not mean the biblical flood story was simply copied from one tablet. Oral traditions may have existed long before the surviving texts, and the biblical account itself reflects a long history of composition and transmission. What matters is that the story belonged to a wider ancient conversation, one in which memories of catastrophic water had already been told and retold for generations. And even that may not take us all the way back to the beginning. A written version is not the birth of a story. It is only the moment when part of that story becomes visible to us. Before clay tablets, there were voices. Before scribes, there were families and villages repeating what they had heard from those who came before them. Somewhere behind the literature may have been memories of real floods, transformed over time until history and meaning became impossible to separate. The story of Noah is therefore both familiar and new, part of an older tradition and also something reshaped by a different vision of humanity, judgment, and renewal. Once we leave the ancient Near East, however, the mystery becomes larger. The similarities between Noah and Utnapishtim can be explained through cultural contact far more easily than flood traditions separated by oceans and continents. Beyond Mesopotamia, the question changes again. We are no longer asking only how one story influenced another. We begin asking why water became such a powerful image of the end of the world. Perhaps the answer is not hidden in one flood at all. Perhaps it lies in the simple fact that people everywhere have lived close enough to water to learn the same lesson. The shore is never as permanent as it looks. Section 6. Once the flood story moves beyond Mesopotamia and the biblical world, the question becomes harder because the similarities can no longer be explained by one simple chain of influence. Across distant regions, people told stories of waters rising over the land, survivors escaping destruction, and a changed world beginning again. Some of these traditions developed far from the ancient Near East, so the resemblance may come from shared memory, shared experience, or simply from the fact that water has always been one of humanity's oldest fears. In ancient Greece, the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha tells of a flood sent by Zeus after humanity had become corrupt. The couple survives in a vessel, and when the waters finally recede, they emerge into a world stripped almost empty of people. The details are different from the Mesopotamian stories, but the emotional shape is familiar. The old world disappears beneath water, a small remnant survives, and life begins again after destruction. Farther east, Indian tradition preserves the story of Manu, who is warned of a coming flood by a mysterious fish. Manu protects the creature as it grows, and in return receives the knowledge needed to survive. When the flood arrives, his vessel is carried to safety, and from that survival, a renewed human world follows. The imagery belongs to another culture and another religious tradition, yet the central idea feels strangely recognizable. Someone receives warning before catastrophe and survives because that warning is believed. These stories do not prove that Greece, India, and Mesopotamia all remembered one ancient flood. Similar stories can arise wherever people live beside rivers, monsoon systems, coastlines, and seas. A civilization along the Euphrates can imagine the end of the world in water, and so can a community living where seasonal rains transform the landscape. When nature teaches similar lessons in distant places, human imagination may produce similar stories without any direct connection between them. That becomes especially important when we remember how ancient people understood the size of their world. A flood did not have to cover the entire planet to feel universal. If a river valley contained nearly every settlement a person knew, then the destruction of that valley could erase the visible world. If coastal water moved inland beyond anything remembered before, survivors might have no way to know how far the disaster extended. Their stories would preserve what the catastrophe felt like, not what a modern map would later reveal. Over generations, the scale of such memories could grow. A flood that destroyed villages might become a flood that destroyed a kingdom, and eventually the kingdom might become the whole world. This does not require anyone to deliberately exaggerate. Oral tradition reshapes events because people remember meaning more easily than measurements. The greater the loss, the larger the story can become until its language matches the emotional size of what happened. There is also a quieter possibility. Some flood traditions may preserve memories older than the cities that eventually wrote them down. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose as great ice sheets melted over thousands of years. Coastlines moved inland, lowlands disappeared, and places once inhabited by people were swallowed by expanding seas. Much of that change was gradual, but local disasters could still have made it sudden and terrifying for individual communities. Imagine growing up near a coast where elders remembered land that no longer existed. Imagine hearing that fields once stretched beyond the present shoreline, or that an old path vanished beneath a bay. Even as details faded, the central image could remain for generations. The water came farther than anyone believed it could. We should be careful with this idea. It is difficult to prove that a particular myth preserves a specific geological event from thousands of years earlier. Stories change, symbols accumulate, and the farther backward we reach, the harder it becomes to separate memory from imagination. Still, these possibilities remind us that ancient myths were born in real landscapes. The people who told them watched rivers rise, coastlines change, storms destroy homes, and familiar ground disappear. Perhaps that is why the flood appears so often near the edge of human memory. Water was never only a source of life. It was also something people could not fully control, capable of nourishing a civilization one season and frightening it the next. Once a generation had watched the boundary between land and water vanish, the memory would have been difficult to forget. Section 7. If some flood traditions were shaped by memories of changing coastlines, then the end of the last ice age becomes especially important. Between roughly 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, the world was warming. Great ice sheets were retreating, and sea levels were rising across the planet. The change was not a single event and did not happen everywhere at the same speed, but over many generations it transformed the map of the world. Valleys became bays, plains became seabeds, islands were separated from continents. Places where people had once walked, hunted, and built shelters slowly disappeared beneath water. For communities living through those changes, the coastline would not have felt permanent. A child might grow up hearing that the sea had once been farther away. An elder might remember fields or paths that had already been lost. Over several generations, a familiar landscape could move beyond recognition, and stories about the old land might become stories about a world that had been taken by water. One of the most famous examples often discussed in this context is the Black Sea. Thousands of years ago, the region experienced major changes as global sea levels rose and connections between surrounding bodies of water shifted. Some researchers have proposed that seawater may have entered the Black Sea basin dramatically enough to flood large areas of previously inhabited land. The scale and speed of that process are still debated, and the evidence does not support treating it as a proven explanation for every ancient flood story. Still, the idea is compelling because it shows how a real geological transformation could create exactly the kind of experience that survives in human memory. Imagine a shoreline advancing year after year until familiar places vanish. Imagine families moving inland, carrying tools, animals, and stories with them. The water does not need to cover a continent to become a catastrophe. It only needs to destroy the place people believed would always be there. Other drowned landscapes tell similar stories without words. Beneath the North Sea lies Doggerland, a broad region that once connected Britain to continental Europe. For thousands of years, people lived there on plains crossed by rivers and wetlands. As sea levels rose, the land shrank, broke apart, and finally disappeared beneath the water. Long before Britain became an island in the form we recognize today, generations watched that transformation unfold. Some parts of Doggerland may also have experienced sudden disaster. A massive submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami more than 8,000 years ago. Waves struck coastlines around the North Atlantic and may have devastated low-lying settlements that had already been pressured by rising seas. For anyone who survived such an event, the sea would have seemed capable of moving with impossible force. We do not know what stories those people told afterward. Their languages are gone, their names are gone. No tablets preserve their memories, yet archaeology reveals enough to remind us that prehistoric people experienced events worthy of myth long before writing existed. That matters because oral memory can sometimes last far longer than we once assumed. In several parts of the world, researchers have studied indigenous traditions that appear to describe landscapes altered by rising seas thousands of years ago. Such claims have to be handled carefully because stories change over time and similarities can be interpreted too confidently, but they show that human memory does not always disappear after a few generations. A powerful event tied to a particular place can remain meaningful for a very long time, and water has an advantage over many other disasters when it comes to memory. A burned forest can grow again, a ruined building can be rebuilt, but when land disappears beneath the sea, the evidence remains visible every day. The shoreline itself becomes a reminder that something was lost. A grandparent can point across the water and say that people once lived farther out. A child can repeat the story, and another child can repeat it after them. After enough time, the exact distance may be forgotten. The names of the settlements may vanish. The speed of the flooding may grow inside the telling. What remains is the memory that the water came and the old land disappeared. This still does not give us one flood behind every flood story. If anything, it suggests something more complicated. Humanity may have carried many flood memories through time, born from river disasters, tsunamis, rising seas, and drowned coastlines in different parts of the world. Some traditions may have met and blended, others may have developed alone. The ancient flood memory may not be the echo of one catastrophe. It may be the echo of many. Section 8. Once we begin looking for flood traditions beyond the ancient Near East, the temptation is to gather them as evidence, as though every story were another mark on a map pointing toward the same forgotten catastrophe. But that approach can mislead us. A myth is not a measurement, and resemblance does not always mean common origin. Sometimes the most useful thing a flood story can tell us is not what happened to the earth, but how a particular culture understood destruction, survival, and the renewal of life. In China, one of the most famous ancient flood traditions does not center on escaping the waters inside a vessel. Instead, it remembers a long struggle to control them. The story of the Great Flood and the hero Yu describes a landscape overwhelmed by water for years, with communities displaced and ordinary life thrown into disorder. Yu succeeds not by hiding from the flood, but by understanding how water moves and guiding it through channels toward the sea. His victory becomes connected with the beginning of political order, turning flood control into a story about civilization itself. That difference matters. In Mesopotamia, the flood can erase the human world and force survivors to begin again. In the tradition surrounding Yu, the flood becomes something humanity endures through knowledge, persistence, and the ability to shape the landscape. The water is still terrifying, but the lesson has changed. Civilization proves itself not by escaping nature, but by learning how to live beside a force that can never be completely controlled. This would have made sense in a region where rivers could bring enormous destruction. The Yellow River has shifted course many times and produced floods capable of devastating wide areas. For communities living nearby, flood control was never only a mythic concern. It was part of the continuing work required to keep settlements alive. Researchers have examined geological evidence for major prehistoric flooding in China and asked whether particular events may have influenced later traditions. One dramatic flood along the Yellow River occurred thousands of years ago after a natural dam failed, releasing a powerful surge downstream. Whether that event stands behind the story of the Great Flood remains uncertain, and the development of the tradition does not allow a simple answer. Even so, geology and memory once again seem close enough to one another to make the question difficult to ignore. Far across the Pacific, flood traditions also appear among peoples whose histories developed far from Mesopotamia. In parts of Polynesia, stories describe overwhelming waters and survivors who endure until the sea withdraws. Among indigenous peoples of the Americas, traditions involving catastrophic floods, great waves, or lands covered by water appear in many forms, shaped by local rivers, coastlines, earthquakes, and storms. Along the northwestern coast of North America, oral traditions describing sudden ocean floods have attracted particular attention because the region lies near the Cascadia subduction zone, capable of producing enormous earthquakes and tsunamis. Geological evidence shows that a major earthquake struck the coast in the year 1700 and sent a tsunami across the Pacific. Some indigenous traditions from the region describe violent shaking and destructive ocean waters in ways that may preserve memories of such events. Here, the distance between geology and oral memory becomes much shorter, reminding us that stories can sometimes carry traces of real catastrophe without becoming precise historical records. That does not mean every tale of rising water should be read as hidden science. Myths gather layers as they move through time. A remembered disaster can become part of a teaching story, a religious tradition, or an explanation of how a people came to understand the land around them. What begins as memory may slowly become identity, warning, or meaning. Perhaps that is why flood stories are so difficult to compare. They are similar because water behaves in similar ways everywhere, but they are different because people do not experience disaster inside the same cultural world. One society may understand survival as divine mercy, another as wisdom, another as punishment, and another as the beginning of social order. The force can resemble itself across continents, while the meaning changes completely. The farther we travel from Mesopotamia, the less likely it becomes that one ancient story can explain everything. Instead, we find communities repeatedly discovering that the ground beneath human life can change, and that water can move farther than expected. When people survive such moments, they carry the memory forward. Over enough generations, that memory becomes part of the world they leave behind. Section 9. By this point, The flood stories have carried us across rivers, coastlines, drowned plains, and cultures separated by enormous distances, but the central question still remains. Are these traditions fragments of one ancient catastrophe, or are they many different memories shaped by the same human fear? The farther we look, the more difficult it becomes to force everything into a single answer, because the evidence points toward a world in which destructive floods happened repeatedly rather than once. There is no clear geological evidence for a single flood covering the entire planet during the age in which human civilizations were developing. The Earth does preserve signs of enormous floods, violent tsunamis, changing coastlines, and seas that rose dramatically after the last ice age. But these events happened in different places and at different times. Some transformed only a valley or coastline, while others altered landscapes across generations. None requires a worldwide deluge to explain why so many cultures remembered water as something capable of destroying the world they knew. That distinction becomes easier to understand when we remember where civilizations were most likely to grow. People settled beside rivers and coasts because water offered fertile soil, food, transportation, and access to trade. The same environments that made settled life possible also exposed communities to some of nature's most unpredictable forces. The earliest cities of Mesopotamia depended upon rivers that could nourish their fields one season and overwhelm them the next. A flood did not need to cover a continent to erase homes, destroy harvests, bury roads, and leave survivors surrounded by a landscape they no longer recognized. For those survivors, the word world would not have meant what it means to us now. They had no view of the planet from above and no way to know what was happening beyond the limits of travel and communication. Their world was the city, the farmland around it, the neighboring settlements they knew, and the horizon beyond which certainty faded. If all of that disappeared beneath water, then the flood had destroyed everything that mattered. This difference in scale may explain why ancient descriptions of universal destruction should be read carefully. When an old story says that the earth was covered, it does not necessarily mean the storyteller imagined every distant land beneath the same ocean. The language may reflect the destruction of the inhabited world as the people telling the story understood it. Memory could enlarge the event even further. A survivor might tell a child that water stretched as far as anyone could see, and decades later, that child might repeat the story after the original landscape had already changed. The exact boundaries of the catastrophe would slowly become less important than what it had felt like. Oral tradition tends to preserve meaning more faithfully than measurement, and the emotional truth of a devastating flood may simply have been that there was nowhere left that felt safe. That may also help explain why flood stories so often acquire religious meaning. Catastrophe without explanation is difficult to live with. A river rising because of distant rainfall or a coastline disappearing beneath a sudden wave does not answer the questions survivors are left asking. Why did this happen? Why did one family survive while another did not? Why was everything allowed to disappear? Myth can give those questions a shape. Over generations, random destruction can become judgment, survival can become purpose, and rebuilding can become the beginning of a renewed world. None of that means the stories are historically worthless. A myth can preserve the memory of a real event while gathering symbolism around it. The appearance of gods, warnings, or miraculous survival does not prove that no disaster occurred. It tells us that human beings rarely remember catastrophe as a neutral report. Trauma becomes story because story is easier to carry. Somewhere beneath the oldest surviving Mesopotamian texts, there may therefore have been a flood remembered with unusual force. It may have devastated several connected settlements and become famous enough to survive long after the witnesses were gone. It may instead represent memories of several floods that gradually blended into one ancestral catastrophe. By the time scribes pressed the story into clay, the original event may already have been centuries old. We may never reach the beginning with certainty. What we can see is what happened afterward. The flood became larger than any single disaster that may have inspired it, crossing languages and centuries while taking on new meanings wherever it traveled. And perhaps that is why the story endured. Beneath all the gods and vessels and drowned landscapes lies a truth every ancient civilization understood. The world can feel permanent, right up until the moment it changes. Section 10. If we return now to Mesopotamia, where the written flood tradition first becomes visible, the ground beneath the old cities offers one more clue. Archaeologists have found evidence that major floods struck parts of southern Mesopotamia in antiquity, and some were severe enough to leave thick layers of silt between periods of human occupation. At first glance, discoveries like these seem almost too perfect. A city associated with an ancient flood tradition, a buried layer of sediment, and a story describing a catastrophe powerful enough to end an age can make it feel as though the mystery has finally been solved. But archaeology rarely gives answers that cleanly. One of the most important sites is Shuruppak, an ancient Sumerian city later connected with the flood survivor. Excavations there revealed a significant flood deposit dating to around the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE. The layer appears to represent a serious inundation, one capable of disrupting life and leaving behind a clear trace in the ground. That alone is remarkable, because it places a real destructive flood within the same cultural landscape that later produced some of humanity's oldest written flood stories. The difficulty is that other Mesopotamian cities also preserve evidence of flooding, but those deposits do not all belong to the same moment. At Ur, Kish, and elsewhere, flood layers appear from different periods. Instead of pointing toward one enormous event that swept across every city at once, the archaeology suggests a region that endured serious floods repeatedly over long stretches of time. For the people who lived there, repeated disaster may have mattered more than a single event. If one generation remembered a devastating flood and another experienced one of its own, the stories could slowly begin to merge. An older tale might absorb details from a newer catastrophe until the memory no longer belonged to one year or one river channel. It could become the flood of the ancestors, the great destruction against which later disasters were measured. This is one of the strange ways memory works. History separates events by date and place, but myth can gather them together. A story may preserve the emotional truth of repeated catastrophes while losing the boundaries between them. In Mesopotamia, where rivers shifted across a broad and nearly level landscape, that possibility feels especially natural. Channels moved, embankments failed, and settlements that seemed secure could suddenly find themselves exposed. Water management reduced the danger, but it never removed it. In such a world, the flood story did not need to be invented from nothing. People had seen water destroy homes and bury fields. They had watched families leave damaged settlements and rebuild. They may even have uncovered older layers of mud beneath new construction, without knowing that thousands of years later, archaeologists would study those same deposits and wonder whether they belonged to the flood remembered in myth. What archaeology can tell us is that catastrophic flooding was real. What it cannot tell us with certainty is which flood became the flood. Perhaps Shuruppak experienced an event memorable enough to spread through neighboring communities. Perhaps an older disaster lies behind the tradition and has left no trace we have recognized. Perhaps generations of floods blended together until storytellers imagined one overwhelming catastrophe in the distant past. The clay tablets cannot take us all the way back, because even the oldest written version was already part of an older tradition. The flood story had a life before the scribe who recorded it, and that earlier life existed in voices we can no longer hear. Still, there is something almost intimate about a layer of ancient flood sediment. The mud is not symbolic. It does not require a story to prove that water was there. Somewhere above it, people returned, rebuilt, and continued living. Whatever they said about the disaster may have changed over centuries, but the ground quietly preserved the fact that something had happened. Perhaps that is as close as we can come to the moment when memory began, people standing beside a damaged settlement after the river had withdrawn, looking across the mud where familiar homes and paths had been, and realizing that the world they knew had changed. Section 11. By now, the flood has become something larger than a single story, because every path we have followed leads back to the same strange place where memory and meaning meet. The oldest texts preserve divine warnings and impossible waters. Archaeology preserves layers of silt and ruined settlements, and geology preserves evidence of coastlines that shifted far beyond the limits of a single lifetime. None of these pieces proves one universal catastrophe, yet together they reveal something just as important. Human beings have lived beside dangerous water for as long as they have built permanent homes. That may be why the flood became such a powerful image. Water does not only destroy, it erases boundaries. Roads disappear beneath it, fields become indistinguishable from rivers, and familiar horizons turn into one continuous surface. When that happens, the world seems to lose its shape. A flood is not simply damage to a settlement, it is a temporary undoing of order. Ancient civilizations were especially vulnerable to that kind of disruption because so much depended on landscapes people could influence but never fully control. Canals could be dug and levees repaired, but none of those efforts could guarantee safety forever. The same was true along coastlines, where generations might live beside the sea before one storm, earthquake, or sudden surge redrew the edge of the land. When events like that happened, survivors were left with more than ruins. They were left with questions about why the disaster came, why some people survived, and whether there had been any warning. Myth gave those questions a form. It transformed catastrophe into something that could be spoken about and carried forward. That may explain why warning appears so often in flood traditions. A warning creates meaning where disaster otherwise feels random. Someone hears what others do not. Someone prepares before the water arrives. Even when later storytellers place that knowledge in the hands of a god, the emotional truth beneath it may have been familiar to anyone who had survived a real flood. Survival often depends on recognizing danger before everyone else believes it is coming. The same is true of what happens after the waters fall. Flood stories rarely end at the moment of greatest destruction. They continue until the land returns and ordinary life becomes possible again. That gives the story its deepest comfort. The old world may be damaged beyond recognition, but the flood does not have the final word. Perhaps this is why these traditions remained alive long after whatever inspired them had passed from living memory. A flood story can hold fear and hope at the same time. It can warn that civilization is fragile, while still insisting that destruction is not always permanent. The world can change completely and still become a place where life continues. That message would have mattered deeply in the ancient world, where cities were destroyed by war, drought emptied settlements, rulers fell, and families were displaced. A flood story could speak to all of those experiences without naming them directly. Water became an image large enough to carry many kinds of loss, and yet The oldest flood traditions still draw us back toward the possibility of real memory because they are so closely tied to landscapes where disaster truly happened. Mesopotamia really did flood. Ancient coastlines really did vanish beneath rising seas. Tsunamis really did strike inhabited shores. The people who witnessed those events had no reason to preserve them as geology. They preserved them in the language available to them, story. That is why the line between myth and history can become so difficult to see. We sometimes imagine that one must cancel out the other, as though a story cannot contain symbolism if it remembers a real event, or cannot preserve history if gods and miracles appear within it. Ancient people did not divide the world so cleanly. For them, event and meaning could exist together. So perhaps the flood memory should not be treated as a puzzle with one hidden answer. It may be better understood as a river gathering many streams as it moves through time. Some may begin in real disasters, others in older traditions, and others in fears shared by people who never met. By the time the story reaches us, those currents have merged so completely that separating them may no longer be possible. And perhaps that is the point. The mystery survives because the flood was never only about what the water covered. It was about what people remembered after the water was gone. Section 12. At the end of this journey, we are left with something more interesting than a simple yes or no. The ancient world probably did not preserve one perfectly intact memory of a single flood that covered the entire planet. The evidence does not lead us there. What it does reveal is a much older and more complicated relationship between human beings and water, one shaped by real disasters, changing landscapes, stories carried across cultures, and the need to make sense of events powerful enough to alter entire communities. In Mesopotamia, the connection is especially clear because the written tradition, the archaeology, and the landscape all belong to the same world. The rivers really did flood. Settlements really were damaged. Layers of sediment still remain beneath ancient cities. At some point, those experiences entered memory, and memory entered story. By the time the tale reached the tablets of Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim, it had already become more than a report of water rising over fields. It had become a story about humanity itself. That transformation is important because it reminds us that ancient people did not preserve the past in the way we do. They did not separate history from religion, disaster from meaning, or memory from myth as neatly as modern readers sometimes expect. A flood could be both something that happened and something that explained the world. A survivor could be remembered as a real ancestor and also become a figure larger than ordinary life. The story could change while still carrying something true inside it. Perhaps that truth was not a date or a place, but a feeling. The fear that everything familiar could disappear, the helplessness of watching the land vanish beneath water, the strange silence after a storm passes and the world outside no longer looks the same. Those experiences are old enough to belong to almost every human culture, which may be why flood traditions can feel related even when their histories are not. And yet, the similarities between some stories are too close to ignore. The ancient Near Eastern traditions clearly influenced one another across centuries, preserving recognizable patterns even as their meanings changed. Elsewhere, similar stories may have grown from entirely different disasters. A coastal community struck by a tsunami, a river civilization devastated by flooding, and a people watching the sea slowly consume ancestral land could all create traditions that sound strangely alike because each begins with the same impossible sight: water where the world used to be. That may be the most useful way to understand the flood memory, not as one story copied endlessly across the earth, and not as a collection of meaningless coincidences, but as many human experiences flowing toward the same image. Water becomes the language through which people describe the collapse of order and the possibility of beginning again. The second half of that idea matters just as much as the first. Flood stories are rarely only about destruction. Their deepest power comes from what happens afterward. The water withdraws, the survivors emerge, the land returns, though changed. Life continues in a place that once seemed lost forever. For ancient listeners, that must have carried enormous comfort. They lived in worlds where cities could fall, harvests could fail, rulers could disappear, and entire communities could be forced from their homes. The flood offered a way of imagining catastrophe without imagining that catastrophe had to be the end. Something could survive, something could be carried through. Maybe that is why these stories remained alive for so long. They were warnings, but they were also promises. They reminded people that the world was fragile without insisting that it was hopeless. Thousands of years later, we still return to them for much the same reason. We look at the tablets, the drowned landscapes, the old layers of mud, and the stories of vessels carried across impossible waters, hoping to find the moment when myth began. We may never find it. The original voices are gone, and whatever disaster first entered the story may have been changed beyond recognition. But perhaps the beginning matters less than what endured. A memory crossed generations. The names changed. The gods changed. The cities rose and disappeared. The rivers shifted their courses, and the shorelines moved. Still, the story remained. Somewhere in the ancient past, people watched the water rise and wondered whether anything of their world would survive. And because someone remembered, something did. And so, seekers, we leave the waters behind. What began as a question about one ancient flood has carried us through ruined cities, shifting rivers, drowned coastlines, old tablets, and stories passed from one generation to the next. We found no single answer large enough to explain every tradition, but perhaps that was never the point. The flood memory survives because it speaks to something older than any one civilization. The knowledge that the world can change suddenly, that what seems permanent can disappear, and that survival often begins with remembering what came before. The people who first told these stories are gone now. Their voices have faded, their cities have crumbled, and many of the landscapes they knew no longer exist in the same form. But something of them remains whenever the story is told again, a warning carried through time, a fear given shape, a memory of water rising and of life continuing after it fell. For now, the archive grows quiet. The story is ending, but the night does not have to. What follows now is music from the scholar's study, soft enough to let the questions drift away and the mind settle into something calmer. Rest well, seekers, and until we meet again in the archive, good night.